You're listening to Runions Have Layers, the podcast where two siblings explore the many layers of life and mental wellness, where vulnerability meets strength and where every shared story is a step towards self-discovery. Join us as we uncover the richness of our experiences and find empowerment in every layer. Today we're going to talk about understanding and navigating grief. Before we begin, we want to emphasize that seeing a mental health professional is absolutely recommended. We are advocates for mental health care and in favor of it, but we also realize that not everyone has access to it. So today we're going to talk about what you can do as an individual to help you understand what your body and brain is going through and give you some tools that'll help you with coping. But first, I want to talk about what grief is. Most people think that grief only happens when someone dies and that it's just sadness, but it really is much more than that. When grief is unresolved and you haven't given yourself or you haven't had the opportunity to process the emotions, it finds a place in your body. And so it shows up in physical ways, like, for example, anger and forgetfulness, digestive issues, apathy, insomnia, lack of energy, those kinds of things. And our society has taught us that emotions need to be suppressed or that we should be strong and just be able to get over it. But grief is a normal and natural reaction to loss or change of any kind. That's another misconception is not only do people just think that grief is sadness, just sadness, but, it's also physical, but it is also, grief happens when people die, as we know, but it also happens when there's a loss of any kind, which can also mean change. So some examples of that would be divorce, moving, chronic illness, change in job, incarceration, loss of safety or loss of trust. Things can be intangible, which means that grief goes all the way back to childhood. And we a lot of times don't realize that. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that grief is not just about when someone dies. I think that is such a misconception that you only experience grief it's when you lose someone. But I think it's important to distinguish that grief is when you lose anything, and that like you were saying, it could be something smaller and less of a major life event. But moving or changing jobs, when you get laid off from a job and it was maybe a blindsided event and you maybe really loved your job. And I mean, I work in the entertainment industry, so a lot of the jobs in entertainment are short-term contracts. And so you spend a very high concentrated amount of time with a group of people and you get to know them really well really quickly, and then in 3 or 4 months you all split and you go your separate ways and you go on about your life. But that time that you spent together you're still building trust and connection with people, and then suddenly it's over. And so I think that I've experienced a lot of grief that in that way, where you're constantly building connections and then they're just ending just suddenly. And it's not by choice, that's just the way of how it works. And so I think it's an important thing to consider, that whenever you're talking about grief, that it can be encompassing of a lot of different aspects of our life. And then it's not just a major life event that is all of a sudden you can't, you're dealing with this huge emotional turmoil, but like it can be in much smaller, what seem like insignificant events.
One thing that I want to point out too is that grief can happen even in good situations like marriage,
100%.
welcoming a baby. If you're losing a job, like you said, maybe you're moving on to a better opportunity, but you're still grieving the loss and the change that was there. And so many people don't realize that. And so as we go through life, all of the events that caused grief just pile up. The way that I like to think about it is either rocks in a backpack, or like every time there's a loss, a cup of water goes into a bucket. And before you know it, it's way too heavy to carry. And that's what happens when we carry this grief through our lives, which then results in a lot of times depression and anxiety and other mental health issues alongside with a lot of the physical issues, some that sometimes can't be explained. People are like, oh, I have, this pain and I don't know what it is. And doctors can't find anything. And I'm not a medical doctor, so, I'm not trying to diagnose anyone, but it can show up in your body. is what I'm trying to say. So,
I think it's important to let the feelings that you have like be felt and to say, like I'm sad about this, even like if you are going to something positive, to not stifle that, and say, yeah, like I'm really excited for my new job, but I'm really bummed that I have to leave this other job because maybe I like the people I work with or whatever. Or like you said, like a new baby, like, yeah, that's exciting. And it's a beginning to a new chapter, but also like that's changing the whole dynamic, whether you don't have kids at all, or whether you're bringing a new baby into a group of kids that you already have. That's going to change the dynamic, it's going to change the energy, it's going to change the stress level, it's going to change how you do things. And so I think that any sort of change is absolutely something to consider. And it's, yeah, I just think I think that's an important point to bring up, that it's not always in bad situations, that it can be in good situations too. And it's it's kind of, I mean, we kind of experience grief in like probably every day. Like I would say we probably all experience grief in some sort of way every single day. That's not, and we don't even realize it. It
mhm.
just comes up, and we're like, oh, I kind of feel down today or whatever, but we don't really identify it as a grief like event.
I had a friend ask me why she was feeling so sad because her son and his girlfriend broke up. And I was like, it's because you're grieving. You're grieving the loss of that because they had a really good relationship. You're grieving the
Mhm.
loss of that relationship. And sometimes we don't think about, we think about that kind of event as happening to somebody else, but it depending on the dynamic of the relationship, we can also grieve too. And I'm glad you mentioned feeling the feelings, because a lot of people divide emotions into, or categorize emotions into good emotions or bad emotions. And they aren't good or bad. There's no morality to it. They just are. They're messengers that tell you that something needs to be addressed. And,
Yep.
obviously in a death situation where you're aware that you're grieving, or sometimes in a divorce, you're aware that you're grieving, you know that something needs to be addressed. But like you were talking about, on a daily basis, there's things that happen that we don't even realize, and they need to be addressed.
Yeah, I think it's important to also think about, you mentioned there's no morality in like the good versus bad thing. And I just think that a lot of the mindset that we have, the duality of good and bad, really comes from like a religious standpoint and
Yeah.
background of considering, like heaven versus hell, and God and the devil, and a sinner and a saint. Like there's always a binary and duality of a lot of things in the world. I think
Hmm.
a lot of people they compare things, they see the world in a very binary way. And I think it also goes with emotions and a bunch of every other things. But I think it's just important to realize that it falls on a whole spectrum of things that can happen. It's okay that you might be happy and mad at the same time. That is totally valid. That can occur. It does happen all the time, and you don't have to feel bad. And see, I'm describing it as bad. You don't have to feel bad about it.
Hmm.
Um, you don't have to see that in a bad way or in a negative light. That it's okay to just acknowledge that you're feeling it. It is the most important on how you respond to it, and how you are able to identify it, how to name it, how to feel it and process it. And that's going to be more helpful than to ignore it, or to not really learn how to deal with it.
Hmm.
Because then what we're saying is that it's going to go somewhere. It has to live somewhere in your body if you're not able to fully process it and get it out of your body. And then that will then come up later in health issues, and that maybe you're not sleeping well, maybe you are starting to eat more and stress because you need to deal with those emotions. So the emotions are there regardless of how you feel about them or how you think about them, whether you think that they're real or not, whether you feel like you deserve to feel the emotions or not. That doesn't matter. They're there regardless.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm glad that you brought up the binary, because a lot of people are taught to just give it to God. And that's not inherently bad. But when you do that, it doesn't, if you don't acknowledge and process the emotions, it's not doing anything for you. It's just
Mhm.
kind of, it kind of falls under that spiritual bypassing toxic positivity
Yep.
mindset where it's just like, just give it to God and he'll take it, or, whatever. And that's not bad for someone to believe it if that's their belief. But in addition to that, also, acknowledging the emotions, and processing them. And guilt is a big thing that a lot of people who are grieving feel. And I do understand that because our grandpa died about a year ago in September. And we weren't super close. And having been a grief educator for 10 years, I know that guilt is when you intentionally do something. It's not something that you could have done or should have done, but I felt guilty because I didn't keep in contact with him all those
Mhm.
years. And even though I had my own stuff going on, I had my own trauma, in an abusive relationship, that is valid, but I still felt guilty. And I had to remind myself that I didn't intentionally ignore him. But that is something that people feel, especially if it's a situation where a person died and they survived. They call it
Mhm.
survivor's guilt and things like that. So I just wanted to point that out. That's easier said than done to just be like, okay, I don't feel guilty anymore. But
Mhm.
I did want to point that out because it's something that's good to think about. Again, what you were saying about the duality is two things can be true at one time. You can have more than one emotion.
Mhm.
I'm sure most people know that we, say, oh, I have mixed emotions about this. But when you're grieving, that doesn't mean that you also can't find inspiration or things that bring you joy or watch a funny movie and laugh. And then when
Mhm.
when that happens, people feel guilty because the person that they lost, if it's a death, aren't there. I know it's a mindset shift and it's really hard when you are grieving, but that's why I'm so passionate about educating people,
Yeah.
because when you're in the throes of grief, you don't think about that stuff. You just know you want to feel better and
Mhm.
you want it, to be over.
Yeah, so you were talking about having mixed emotions. There is actually an emotion for it. It's called bittersweet, and it's when you do have these two different emotions that are in competing priority. They're competing for like two separate things, and you're feeling them at the same time. And so that actually, and it's actually there's a word for it in a bunch of different languages, and they all mean the same thing. And
Really?
so, yeah, regardless of what culture you're from, there is some sort of way to express when you are feeling bittersweet and you're feeling sad and happy at the same time. The things that we feel, grief, goes across languages and cultures and life experiences, and it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what you believe in, it doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter any of that, your background. Grief is universal, and we will all feel grief at some point if you haven't already, which I'm sure everyone has who's listening to this.
I'm glad you brought that up about bittersweet because it kind of brings me back to what we were talking about, feeling the two different emotions. A lot of people feel like they have to put on a brave face or they have to pretend like everything's okay. But that doesn't help you heal. It just distracts you from the pain and, the loneliness that you're feeling. And it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be sad. It's also okay to feel joy or to have, happy emotions at the same time.
Yep.
And sometimes it's hard to reconcile in our brains. And some of that is, because it depends on the loss that was experienced, but also that's what we've been taught all our lives. And so,
Mhm.
everyone grieves so incredibly differently. Some people, break down crying and some people don't. It doesn't mean that they're grieving any less or that it impacted them any less.
Mhm.
It's just the form of expression is different. I want to read this quote by Amy Patcherell, and it says, as with any injury, an emotionally traumatized mind requires a period of recovery and rehabilitation. We don't return to our usual activities immediately after heart surgery, yet somehow we expect to bounce back after the mind scramble of losing a loved one. And I would add to that, or any loss, because as we're talking about, grief is more than just that. And I thought that was really powerful because it's true. A lot of people have bereavement leave at work, and sometimes it's only one day or only 3 days. And
Mhm.
that is not nearly enough time to grieve. But here in America, we just are in the rat race, go, 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 and don't get the opportunity to properly grieve. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this so that we can tell people what they can do on a daily basis themselves, while they're in the midst of this.
The bringing that bereavement one day thing up, I feel like people don't feel like they're entitled to like take care of themselves mentally, and I think that is a very American thing to not take a moment and slow down and to identify what is actually happening. We distract ourselves with work and keeping busy with things, whatever
Mhm.
that is, work or hobbies, and instead of taking that time and realizing that, oh, I'm having some sort of mental crisis right now, or I'm feeling a certain way about this loss that I've experienced, and taking that time for yourself. I think going back to guilt, I feel guilty that they have to take away from their team at work and maybe put more pressure on them, or I have to not give time to this other thing, and you feel bad about that and guilty about that. But when you're sick, when your physical body's sick, you're like, yeah, I'm not going to go to work. I feel sick. I can't go into work. And I think really distinguishing that your mental health is just as high of a priority as your physical health, and that you're allowed to give value to that and to take time for yourself to recoup, because our brains need to have some time to recuperate as well. And we can't always be on all the time and expect to function at the same level. And it goes for our physical health and for our mental health. And also, we're talking about emotional health really right now, and to really give ourselves time to let our bodies process and feel the emotions that we're feeling.
I'm glad you brought that up about distractions because a lot of people try to distract themselves from the emotions that they're feeling and they may not even realize. I just wanted to give a few examples of what that would be. So, you mentioned work, shopping, gambling, sex, drinking, drugs, those kinds of things that numb, emotionally numbing behaviors is a lot of things that people engage in because they don't want to think about it. They don't want to feel it. And while that seems simple and easy to understand, and you think that you might recognize that behavior in yourself, it's interesting as somebody who's been doing this for so long. Sometimes I even do that and don't realize it. And I have to kind of go back to the process like, okay, what am I feeling? Like you said, identifying the emotion. Something else I want to talk about is the stages of grief. Some people, are familiar with the stages of grief because of a book written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And that was intended for people who had terminal illness. It was never about bereavement. It was never about loss in general. And people assign these stages and think that they have to go in a linear order. And the fact is that stages of grief don't exist. Now, the emotions that you feel in those stages are completely valid, but they don't happen in order. And a lot of people have that misconception because, again, this is what we've been taught and what we've learned, but it's not linear and it doesn't have a timeline at all. And so, thinking this way can sometimes create unrealistic expectations about the grieving process, how long it's going to be, and what you're expected to feel at any moment. And everybody is so unique in their grief and everyone is individual. So not everyone is going to feel the same thing.
Just to name what the 5 stages of grief are that were identified in her book, it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we all feel, when we feel grief, there's some form of all of these emotions that come up for us. And like Holly said, it's not a linear thing. Might feel these in different orders. We might feel them in a cycle. I know that I've definitely felt a lot of these emotions, like when our dad died. A lot of these emotions still come up for me sometimes,
Mhm.
and it doesn't have to be, there's not necessarily an ending to it. And I think that when we grieve things, they don't really go away. They change us in a way, and they really affect us, and kind of in a way change the course of how we see the world, really. And I think it impacts the way that we live in the world, the way we see in the world, the way that we treat people. Because I think that for me at least, in understanding what all of these emotions are and how to cope with them, it's actually given me a lot more empathy for people. And also going through a divorce, for some reason, like I just have more empathy for people and their situations, and I'm
Mhm.
more willing to give them the benefit of the doubt than I think I used to. And being, yeah, just more receptive to what people have to say. And I think a lot of that has to do with the grieving process and like dealing with what those really difficult emotions are, because during a grieving process, you feel so alone.
Yeah.
I certainly do. And it feels like what you're feeling is the worst thing in the world and it's never going to end, and that you
Hmm.
just don't really understand. And like you said before, when you're in the throes of grieving, it's hard to pick yourself up and pull yourself out of that and to really continue forward with life, and to go to work and to not fall apart, you know?
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we're talking about, what we're gonna continue to talk about, is how to put some things into practice that can help you with the grieving process, how to process the emotions, and how to continue to move forward in life.
I want to ask you, when you said that you felt alone, was that because you didn't want to burden other people, kind of like we were talking about earlier, and or because you felt like no one would understand, or was it maybe something else?
I think for me, I mean, I was what, 10 years younger than I am now, and I definitely didn't have the emotional intelligence that I have now. So I think for me, I didn't really know how to talk about my emotions. I think I felt embarrassed, honestly. I felt I think it has to do with a cultural thing where, as a straight white male, you're not supposed to expose your emotions. You're supposed to be tough. So I think
Right.
there's a lot of that for me personally. I think that's where a lot of it was stemming from, but also our family didn't talk about emotions really growing
No.
up. Like our family didn't like talk about emotions. They didn't express emotions very healthy. And so I personally didn't have a good example, and I'm sure you can relate because we grew up in the same household, but at different times, you
Hmm.
know. So I mean, so I didn't even know how to start the conversation with you or with mom or Barry or Brandon. I just didn't have the tools to be able to talk about it. So I felt a little embarrassed because I didn't know how to. And with my friends, um, I feel like, yeah, like they didn't. I feel like they didn't understand. That they probably couldn't relate. Also, didn't want to burden people. So I think it's a mixture of a lot of that is like not really knowing how to start the conversations,
Hmm.
and not really feeling like it would be received
Yeah.
well, and just not really knowing how to deal with that if someone was like, oh, like, I don't really know how to help you. So, and also like you were dealing with the grief, like our whole family was dealing with the grief at the same time.
Yeah.
So that was another like, well, why should they care about how I'm feeling, because they're feeling, you know they're grieving at the same time.
That reminds me of the stages of grief that we were talking about, how people think that they're supposed to express emotions a certain way or in a certain order. And, a lot of people are uncomfortable when people are expressing emotions. But just because other people are uncomfortable with your emotions doesn't mean that's wrong or that's bad or that you shouldn't do it, because that's their issue. Expressing our emotions and being in a safe space to do that is really what's going to help process. I also wanted to talk about how grief changes the brain. It was something that we mentioned earlier at the beginning. And I just have a quick list here that I wanted to go over, because when I learned this, it was kind of eye opening to me, about what goes on in our brain. So the brain responds to loss by suppressing the emotions, and the stress of losing something important activates the neural pathways, which is also known as neuroplasticity or rewiring your brain. Grief affects memory, concentration, and cognition. Your brain is focused on, at the time of grief, focused on the feelings and the symptoms, which leaves little room for everyday tasks and things that you need to do. And you go into survival mode. It activates the fight or flight, and a lot of people don't associate grief with survival mode, but that is really what happens. And so when our brains experience negative emotions, or what we perceive to be negative, quote unquote, they can easily become hardwired into the brain, because it's a constant cycle of thinking those thoughts. And then when we avoid the painful emotions, it doesn't give our brain the opportunity to learn to manage and process them.
When you're talking about how we're experiencing all of these emotions and we see them negatively, and if we see them in that way, we're building a habit with that. And every time that we treat the grief and those emotions that we experience with grief in a negative way, and we don't give ourselves the time to process those emotions, we're starting to build a habit. And
Mhm.
I think we don't realize that when we do it, but it's like every time you experience that and you categorize it as like, oh, this is a bad thing, or I'm not allowed to experience this emotion. It's letting ourselves build that habit that that's what it is, and every time, and then we habitually start to treat it as something that we should be embarrassed about, or that we shouldn't talk about, or that we need to be quiet about, or that people don't want to hear about. So I think that's an important thing to realize, that is to name it what it is, to acknowledge it, and that you don't have to like negatively self-talk that, oh, this is bad, or oh, I shouldn't feel this way, or people don't care, so that's an important thing to bring up. And those tiny little things over time will start to build a better habit and a practice for being able to see grief in a different way than just negative.
Yeah, definitely. And our brain believes what we tell it. And so that doesn't mean just ignoring the grief and denying that it happened or saying, "Oh, everything's going to be okay." But if you aren't open to healing, then and if you believe it'll always be this way, it will be harder to heal. And while you're, experiencing a very fresh loss, it is easy to think or feel like it's always going to be that way, even though you see people who have experienced the same thing having moved forward with their lives and getting on with things. It does feel like that, but that's just something that's important to remember, even if you write it on a post-it note and just remind yourself, like, I'll get through this, even if that's
Mhm.
the only thing positive that you're telling yourself. That's important too, because you have to believe that you're going to get through it.
Yeah, it's easy to not see a way forward
Hmm.
when whenever you something happens. Like, I remember when I first was going through my divorce, and like you feel like your whole life is over, and the way that you lived your life, and your habits, and your routines, and where you lived, and everything you did, is like, for me, was over. And so starting fresh, and like feeling like you're never going to have that life, that kind of life again, that kind of routine
Hmm.
again, that kind of connection, or whatever. um I think it's easy to not see a way forward. And I think you have to, for me, I had a really good friend that I talked a lot to about this, and like talking about the emotion and letting yourself feel what that is, and being pissed off about it, and not worrying about what you're going to say, like finding people that you trust, you can talk to, that you can say anything you need to. For me, what I did is, I actually, on my phone, I recorded voice memos, and that I just said whatever I wanted, and I cussed her out, I cried, I whatever I needed to say, whatever I needed to do,
Hmm.
I that's what I did, because I felt like there was some sort of, um I wasn't just it wasn't just going out into air, like, it was being recorded. And so for me, I felt like there was some sort of weight to that. And I also used a lot of journaling and things like that to help me process, and like just get my emotions out of my body.
Yeah.
Um, Something that's like more embodied. So that those are ways that I did, but it's easy to not to feel like there's not a way forward, for sure. That's a totally valid way to feel about it.
It's overwhelming, and again, your body is in survival mode, that fight or flight response, and your nervous system is overloaded, and yeah, it is easy to feel that way. And it's not something that you just get over, like you talked about. You carry that with you. It doesn't Grief just doesn't disappear. There's a way to move forward without having to move on, because a lot of people that I have worked with, they absolutely hate the term moving on because they feel like they're leaving their person in the past, or they have to forget about trauma that happened, or, what have you. And they're different. You can move forward and still honor and remember your losses and still gain coping tools and build resilience and things like that in your life and have peace, but still fondly remember, like, dad died 10 years ago. And similarly to you, I have moments where I just break down crying because I
Mm,
miss him and I want to tell him something, or whatever, but it's not that intense all day every day. So
right.
that's a good example of, yeah, we still feel the grief. We can sit around and tell stories and laugh and then end up crying, but it's different than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, but it still lives in our bodies. It's still very much, it's very present um all the time, but it's not like in your face,
Right.
like, oh, I'm so sad, but it still lives there. And I think
Yeah.
that people can relate to that. And I think it's important to also to say that the things that we grieve can feel like really heavy, and really weigh us down, and it feels real like we have to carry that for a long time. And sometimes we don't really understand why things happen. We don't understand how to deal with them. We don't understand what to do and how to move forward. I think that finding meaning in what we're experiencing, and not that I hate the saying everything happens for a reason. I fucking hate it so much. And I think that for me is personally tied to a religious perspective. And which is, I think that's my own work that I have to do. But I think that there can be meaning found in what we experience. And it's not how to take this thing and how to make it positive some way.
Right.
It's not seeing the silver lining necessarily. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I think that the things that we experience, how do we, for me, this is what I'm trying to say is like when you're finding meaning, you're trying to take that experience and learn how to grow from it, how to how to see yourself differently. For me, with my divorce, there were things that I contributed to that situation. It wasn't just all her, and it wasn't all bad. And so seeing things that happened and how did we get to this point to where we decided that we weren't going to be together anymore. There were things that I contributed. There were things that I brought to the relationship that affected it. And so how can I reflect on that situation and how can I grow from that so I don't make those same mistakes again, or that if I don't want to be that kind of person, how do I behave differently? How do I talk differently? How do I respond differently to situations, to my emotions, to what other people are telling me? So that's kind of what I brought from it. And I read a really amazing book that one of my mentors, who also went through divorce, recommended, called "When Things Fall Apart" by Pema Chodron, or Chodron, I think is how you pronounce her last name. And she's a Buddhist, and she has a lot of teachings about, really, it's kind of a guide to dealing with just challenges in life in general, but finding meaning in everyday challenges and in huge life challenges. So that's kind of what I mean by finding meaning in it.
I was thinking about that too. Like, does every loss have to have a meaning? Or do we have to find meaning in every loss? Not necessarily, but for me, it's helped my healing process. So, all of the grief and trauma and abuse and things that I experienced, it took a while to get to the point where I could talk about it and help other people. But I don't know if you're into the enneagram. Is that how you say it? An enneagram?
Oh yeah,
I'm
like the personality thing.
Yeah, I'm number 2, which is the helper. And I have always, worked in jobs where it was like, public service or nonprofit or anything like that. And so how I found meaning is taking my experience and helping other people, because I felt so I mean, I didn't even know you could be that depressed. I mean, I was so bad off. I know you weren't with me in person, but I'm sure you remember that time frame. Um, And I want to help other people to be able to recognize and process their grief, their emotions, all that stuff, so that they have tools in a toolbox, so to speak, or they have a way forward. Because I remember feeling like nobody understood and I was all alone, and I wanted to get better, but I didn't know how. I didn't even know where to start.
Mm,
And for me, grief work was the catalyst to that. And that may or may not be true for other people, but as we've talked about, we all experience grief at some point in our lives. And so that's always a good place to start, in my opinion. I want to talk about some common misconceptions about grief. One misconception is that grief only happens after death and that it's on a, predictable timeline, and that, being strong and, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and stuff like that. You don't have to be strong for anyone, especially kids, because they learn from the adults in their lives how to grieve and how to express their emotions. And so if they don't see you doing it, or they don't hear you talking about it, to them, because they're feeling it too, especially if it's like, loss of a grandparent or something like that, then they'll learn that's how it's supposed to be. And I remember when I heard someone say this, my kids were a lot younger, and I used to go cry in the bathroom because I didn't want them to see me, and then I'd wash off my face. And after I learned that, I didn't like just break down and cry, but I mean, I don't hide my emotions anymore like that. And yeah, sometimes it does make people uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's their discomfort. But anyway, another one is time heals. Time heals all wounds. It's not the time that heals, it's the action taken during the time that helps heal. Because I mean, if you think about it, there's people that there was, let's say, a death 30 years ago or something, some loss or some event, and they have suffered like this whole time. They've had to move forward in their life to be able to survive day to day in the world, but emotionally they haven't been able to move forward. So, time does not heal all alone. Also, that people think that talking about someone that died, is something to avoid. And a lot of times when people lost a loved one, they want to share stories and they want to talk about their person. And it doesn't mean forgetting the person who died. That's, a lot of people think that moving forward means that you just have to forget. So I don't know. Are there any misconceptions that you've heard or that you're aware of?
those are all the ones that I hear the most and that people talk about often. I just want to go back to what you said about kids and how kids see emotions, and I don't know the answer to this, but it's just an observation that I've seen a lot, and it's like how do we teach children to express their emotions, and what's the boundary of teaching them how to behave and to and to like express their emotions in a healthy way, like teaching them that like you can't just break down in Walmart and sit on the floor and cry, but I also want you to know that it's okay to feel upset about it and that it's
Mhm.
okay if you want to cry about it, but you still have there's not a there's a time and a place for where and how to release those emotions. So I mean, I don't have kids, so I don't know the answer to that, but it's something I always think about because I think it's important that the way that kids are learning how to express emotions is important. I agree with that. And I think that as parents and adults, people should realize that that is an important thing. But I don't know what that distinguishing factor is between that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that since you're a parent.
Well, my kids are older now. My youngest is 16, but and so when they were young, I did not have the emotional maturity or insight that I do now. And so, I kind of cringe when I go back and think about, I would tell them to stop crying or go cry in your room. The things that now I'm actively trying to educate people on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I agree that there's a time and a place. But sometimes we can't control our emotions when they come up. And so it's not necessarily, telling them don't do that or be quiet, or, that goes back to the parent or whoever's with them, the adult that's with them, being uncomfortable or feeling embarrassed. And that also goes back to societal expectations of how kids
Hmm.
should behave. Like, it's bigger, it's much bigger than kids just being able to express their emotions, but letting them know that having big emotions is normal, that it's okay, and giving them coping tools, For kids, I'm not as well versed with kids. I do know like blowing, because deep breathing and breath work is a good way to calm down. So having them blow like they're blowing out a candle, I mean, I haven't had a toddler in a very long time, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but that's a good point though, that teaching them, and when they're super young, like 2 and 3, they're not going to cognitively understand there's a time and a place, so I guess showing them.
And also some patience. I think a lot of, I mean, I don't want to go into this whole tangent of like parenting or anything, but I'm just saying that perhaps parents don't allow their kids to feel the emotions because they don't have the patience for it. They don't want to deal with the outbursts. They don't want to deal with whatever that is. They want them to behave. They don't want to feel embarrassed with their kids acting out and all of that sort of stuff. And I just want to bring that up, that it's not just how we deal with our personal emotions. And I think it's important that parents also realize that how they act in front of their kids is important. How they express emotions in front of kids is important, and how they allow their kids to express emotions, and showing them and modeling to them that it's okay that you're feeling this way. That I think is a really crucial way to teach them how to express emotion. So when they are adults or when they are teenagers, they can express the emotions. They can come to you and say, I'm feeling really stressed out about this test that I'm going to have, or
Mhm.
I just broke up with my girlfriend and I don't know, I'm feeling really sad about it. I think that actually opens a door to a healthier parent child dynamic,
Yeah.
because when you show them that they can express emotions and that you are okay with that, that in a way builds some trust, and like it opens a line of communication instead of it always being about discipline and you have to do what I tell you. It opens another side of that relationship, I think, that to where they can trust you and come to you and talk to you about things that are hard,
Mhm.
that they don't have to learn from someone at school
Right.
or the internet now.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I think that's just an important part, and I know it's all connected, but I think that's just a really important piece of the grief, because we learn it from somewhere. We learn how to
Right.
deal with emotions from somewhere. And yeah, we can talk about how we as adults want to deal with it and how do we cope with it. But going back to like childhood, everything that everything that we experience, I think, goes back to childhood.
Yeah.
And how do we learn and unlearn and relearn things so that we can become better humans and treat people more humanely.
I think that, how we talked about like the older generations didn't talk about emotions, it didn't express emotions. And so I feel like our generation is like we're learning so that we can teach the ones that are, are like our kids and things like that. And I'm so grateful for that because, my kids are older and they do come to me. I mean, I know there's stuff that they don't tell me because I'm their mom, but they do come to me when they're upset and they are comfortable crying in front of me and things like that. And I'm just so grateful because I want them to feel safe and comfortable in my home and not feel like they can't express themselves or they can't tell me what's really bothering them. So yeah, that's something that I've really enjoyed about learning about emotions and the grieving process.
Why don't we talk about how we can respond to someone who's grieving, and how to, like, maybe things that we should say or that are helpful to say, and things that are unhelpful, and things that might like push people away or, make them angry, or like it's just not a helpful thing to say.
And well, a lot of times people have good intentions, but what they say invalidates the pain and invalidates, their experience. And something that's important to remember is that people who are grieving, they just want to be heard. They want to be validated. They don't want to be fixed. And we as humans have this, tendency to want to fix people. And I don't know if that comes from us being uncomfortable or just wanting to like make them less sad. I don't know. But we talked about earlier that everything happens for a reason. That is one of the worst things you can say. God needed another angel, or God took, this person. Any statement that starts with the phrase at least you have another child, or at least you can get another pet, or at least you had, a lot of good years with that person, like that doesn't help at all.
Yeah, talk about invalidating.
I know. Or like they're in a better place. All of those things I know come from a good place. that,
Or
the
God
person.
has a plan.
Yeah, yes, that one too.
Okay, I think anything like religious is for me, I think kind of like a cop out. It's just like I don't know how to explain this. I don't know how to make you feel better, so I'm gonna tell you something that's quote unquote like higher than us, that has more meaning than our little life down here on earth. Yeah, I think everything happens for a reason for sure is the one that gets me the most. And I think that's just like my own personal thing, but having empathy for someone is really the best way to show that you're there. You don't have to fix that going to what
Mhm.
you're saying. I think that's a natural thing, but just to be there and listen and to acknowledge and validate that, yeah, I see that you're hurting. I see that you're in pain. I see that you are dealing with something hard. It doesn't have to be a loss. It could be, yeah, I see that you're dealing with this new position that you're in.
Mhm.
Or I see that you've left this job that you really like, that maybe you built a community with, and now you're with this other job. There's a whole range of things. I think the important piece is acknowledging and showing that you are listening and that you are seeing them for where they are. Period. That's all it has to be. And you just hold space for that.
And, I just want to point out that if people believe everything happens for a reason or they're in a better place, like there's nothing wrong with believing that for yourself.
100%.
But
Yeah.
when you tell other people that, it invalidates what they're going through. And what I like to tell people is imagine what you would want to hear or how you would feel if you just lost a spouse or a parent or a pet or whatever. Losing a pet was one of the hardest things that I've ever gone through, and I didn't realize, I mean, I knew that that is a valid form of grief, but I had never lost a pet before. And it was, it was hard. Yeah. I mean, those types of things, I like to tell people, imagine how you would feel or what you would want to hear if you
Hmm.
were going through something like that. And a couple of examples that you can say is, I can only imagine what you're going through. I've talked to different people. Some people, they don't like when they say, I can't imagine what you're going through. It sounds like just semantics, but some people feel like if you say that, it's just because you don't want to imagine it. And I
Mm.
think either of these is okay, but I just want to point that out. And sometimes we don't have the words. And just telling people, I don't know what to say. I wish I had the words, I'm here for you, or,
Yeah.
whatever. And going back to sharing memories, sometimes that is also, and of course, you have to know the person and know kind of where they are at in their journey, or sometimes just being there and let them
Mhm.
cry, let them express what they need to express, give them a hug if they, are okay with hugs, and do it, just be there without criticizing, without judging, without fixing, without expecting a timeline. A lot of people, another thing not to say is you should be over this by now, or aren't you over
Mhm.
this by now? Because that goes
Yeah.
back to everyone is individual and unique and grieves differently.
Yeah, I think also not making it about yourself. Because everyone is grieving their own things, and maybe someone is grieving based on the same event, family member or a friend or whoever. And if you're being there for someone else, to not turn that around and make it about your own grief or your other situation, and like, oh yeah, I felt like this when blah 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 happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a way to invalidate what that person's feeling too, because then it's not acknowledging what
Yeah.
they're feeling, it's taking that and then making it about yourself. So I think that's also unhelpful too.
Yeah. I think we talked about, I can't remember if I mentioned it, but also I know how you feel is
Hmm.
is something
Oh
not to
yeah.
say, because you don't know exactly how that person feels. You may have had the same loss or also experienced a divorce or been in a similar situation, but we never know exactly what someone's going through. And people say that thinking that it's comforting, and everyone's different. Some of these statements might be comforting to other people, but the majority of people that I've talked to don't like these at all.
Yeah.
And it goes back to just being able to understand and recognize and believe that it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling, regardless of what people think, or if they're judging you, or thinking that you need to move through it more quickly. They don't understand, and they think that it should be done a certain way. Okay, well, they can do that in their lives if they
Yeah.
want to. I was just going to read a quote real quick that I saw that
Mhm.
it kind of explains this, or, I like the way that it says it. It's by Nicole Landman. It says, grief is like surfing, except you're blindfolded in a hurricane and your surfboard is on fire. And the people on the shore are shouting surfing strategies from a storm they've never surfed, and then shaking their heads at how you handled the waves. And I just think that's really powerful because people don't understand the grief until they've been through a similar situation. It's so easy
Mhm.
to stand on the outside and think, gosh, aren't they over that by now?
Yeah.
But they're not dealing with the exact situation.
I think that's life in general,
Yeah.
but, because everyone has their own point of view on life, and that's totally fine. But I think it goes back to people feeling uncomfortable and having certain expectations about how long it should take and how long it takes you to cope with that and to get over it and to move forward. And everyone's different, so one person's grieving process might be quicker, might be slower, it might be in a different order. And it's important to not judge
Mhm.
that person's process. I think it's a delicate balance to still be empathetic and show that you're supporting them and that you see what they're dealing with, and also that you still have to keep those boundaries in place. I think that's just a really important thing to realize. And someone like, I'm a leader and lead people and deal with a lot of emotions, especially with artists and performers. Things come up all the time, and it's hard to keep that balance because it's not about them doing their job. I mean, it is about they have to do their job, but you also still need to be there and show that you're not invalidating what they're going through.
Right.
Um, that you still have to acknowledge that and validate that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up boundaries because that was something that I wanted to talk about. And the way that I was thinking of it was more in like personal life with friends and family and things like that. Boundaries do still need to be set at work, but I mean, it what boundaries do is it helps you verbalize what is impacting your comfort level at the time. And I mean, I don't know how that works in a professional environment. I don't know if I'd be able to tell a supervisor, no, I'm not. I don't know. I don't know how to set boundaries at work. I don't know. Do you have maybe an example of how somebody could do that?
An example would be like, please don't share this with anyone else.
Hmm.
That's a way to set a boundary. Like if you're going to tell your boss,
Yeah.
just so they're aware that, hey, I might be a little, I might be like more quiet. I might not be as outgoing as I normally am, or whatever. Just so they're aware, so they're not like feeling like you're not doing your job up to par. You can let them know and say, I'd really appreciate it if you don't share this with anyone, because it's something I want to keep private. And I think that's probably the best way that you can set a boundary at work personally.
Yeah. And on the flip side, for like the employee, I was trying to think of what a good example would be and say, like, maybe you have to go to work, but then you really want to spend your time in the evenings doing, whatever people do in the evening. And they need to set a boundary. I'm only going to stay until 5 o'clock, or I'm not going to answer my phone or any text messages or anything until the next day. And that may not apply to anybody, but that's to everybody, but that's a good example of just how in a work environment, you could set a boundary. Or I don't want to talk about this with you. I mean, there's nicer ways to say that, but that's also a boundary.
Yeah, for sure.
But like, to family or friends, you can say something like, I understand that you want to help, you really want to help me, but right now I need to focus on my own healing. Please don't offer me unsolicited advice or try to fix my grief. I know it comes down to comfort level because setting boundaries can feel really awkward when you're not used to it. And, you're afraid that the other person's going to be upset, or they're going to, how they're going to react or whatever. But it does get easier as time goes on. And I think it's really important for my own mental sanity and mental health because, it helps in all areas of life, in my opinion.
Another way to set a boundary or to enforce a boundary, and also to still connect with family members or friends, is to say something like, I appreciate that you're there, and you can just ask for time and say, I just need time
Mhm.
to process a little bit on my own. And when I've processed some, I'll come back to you and I'll ask for help. So I think that not totally shutting it down and saying, I don't want your help, saying, I appreciate that you want to help, but I
Mhm.
just need more time to process, so I can understand what sort of help I even need. If you don't understand how you're feeling, you don't know what sort of help you even need and how to ask for a certain kind of help. So I think it's okay to ask for time too, and to ask for a little bit of grace from people. Just like, like, I just want to be alone, and
Yeah.
I just want to feel on my own for right now, and then I'll come back and I'll talk about it later.
Unless you want to shut it down and you don't want to talk about it later. But I think that's,
Yeah,
yeah,
it depends on the person and the relationship. And
exactly. But I'm glad that you said something about grace, because I wanted to talk about self care and giving ourselves grace to go through this process. We talked about how people just expect us to bounce back. We expect ourselves to bounce back, but we can't do that unless we're taking care of ourselves first. And the way that I like to think about it is on an airplane, when with the oxygen mask, you have to put yours on before you help other people. Or the empty cup, you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to be able to fill your own cup first. And a lot of people think that self-care is selfish, that taking care of ourselves is, I don't know where that comes from. But self-care isn't, I mean, it is about taking care of yourself, but it's not just like taking baths and, relaxing at home and reading a good book. All those are great, but self-care really is all the little things that build up to create a life that to where you are more resilient, where you're cultivating resilience. That's really what self-care is. Um, but another thing that goes in this category is rest. People think that they have to earn rest, or that if they're not being productive, that something is wrong. And rest is productive. That's a mindset shift. But it's true. It's something that I will say for the rest of my life. And when you think about it, grief is extremely draining. I mean, any kind
yeah,
of emotion, but specifically grief. But resting is going to, help your physical recovery, your mental recovery. It's going to help you to take a break from processing, or constantly ruminating and thinking about the emotions, and it helps reduce stress. I mean, we all know this, but it's just a good reminder to give yourself some grace. You can't be like the Energizer Bunny and just keep going, going, going. Something that I did unintentionally, that I didn't even realize I was doing, was activating what they call happy hormones by creating habits daily. So one example that I like to use is watching funny videos, like just going on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and watching funny animal videos or baby videos, or whatever is cute, because that releases endorphins. And then I just want to give a couple more. You mentioned listening to music. That releases dopamine, which is the reward chemical. Serotonin, meditating or exercise, something like that. And that's for good moods. And then oxytocin is the love hormone. And that's, spending time with a pet or spending time with friends. And it doesn't have to be like this big, huge thing that you're consciously like, I'm going to make my brain release serotonin right now. It's just getting into these small little habits every day. Like one thing that I like to do for self-care is I have a UV sun lamp, because I am deficient in vitamin D. And so I like to get up in the morning and have my UV lamp on and have my coffee and, journal a little bit and watch something funny. It's like something that I do every single day, and it adds up. And before you know it, I mean, it doesn't make the grief go away. It doesn't make you magically feel better, but before you know it, you've created all these habits to help you process the grief and to move forward and to cultivate resilience in your life. And it sounds, like it wouldn't help, or it sounds kind of silly, but that's one of the main things, creating those habits, that helped me in my healing process.
have you ever read Atomic Habits by James Clear?
It's on my list. I have not yet.
It's a great book for people who want to change habits, to build habits, to remove habits that you maybe not you don't want to do, like smoking, for example. And he talks about how building a habit, you're not just like you're practicing a new skill. Like I'm a drummer. I've been playing for 29 years, and I didn't get to where I am in one day, in 1 week, in 1 month. It was a dedicated, committed effort to practicing every day, to learning, to listening, to making mistakes, but still continuing to work on it, and moving forward on learning how to play drums and to be a great drummer. And I think that goes with any habit that you approach that you want to start, that it doesn't even have to be for, like, if you say you want to start journaling, it doesn't have to be, I need to sit down for 30 minutes. I need to journal for 30 minutes. Like, you can start with, I'm going to journal for 2 minutes today. I'm just going to open it. I'm going to write maybe a little piece of gratitude. I'm gratitude
Hmm.
about this today. It can start with something as simple as that. And if you do that every day, it starts to build a habit, and maybe you start writing a little bit more and a little bit more. And maybe by a year in, you've written for 30 minutes, you know?
Right.
So it doesn't have to be, I'm going to start today and I'm going to reach this goal of journaling for 30 minutes. Because maybe you don't have the time, you haven't worked that into your daily routine. So you have to start small and work your way up to where you want to be. And I think that when we set goals, we expect ourselves to, oh, I'm going to change the way my diet, or I'm going to start working out, or I'm going to do this and do that. And in his book, he talks about why people don't achieve their new habits is because they're going from 0 to 100, and they're expecting themselves to just get there magically, just
Right.
because their mindset is like, oh, I want to do this thing. But you have to get your body in the habit of doing this thing repeatedly, and it takes time and it takes practice
Yeah.
to get to establishing those habits. So
Yeah. I mean, I like to say that healing is intentional. And also, healing is a journey, not a destination. Those are two of the things that I remind myself, because I used to consider, like, healing from grief and trauma. There was a point that I reached where I was like, PTSD is in remission and I'm good to go. And then something happened, not a bad thing. It was actually a good situation, and it brought back all kinds of crap, just stuff, all the triggers and stuff. And it's been a continual journey. But
mhm.
now I have the tools, whereas 10 years ago, I didn't have the tools and I just completely shut down and had a breakdown, basically. But now I have the tools to address that. And so it's just important to remember in the grief journey is that, as we talked about, it never goes away. Um, and it's something that we have to intentionally focus on healing day to day. So, to recap, a couple of ways that practical tips for navigating grief that we talked about: setting boundaries, making sure that you make time for self care, um, finding a support system, whatever that looks like for you, making sure that you surround yourself with people that respect your boundaries and that can hold space for your grief without trying to fix you, um, journaling or some kind of creative outlet. And, with journaling, I wanted to point out that it doesn't have to be written. It can be on the notes app in your phone. It can be the voice memo, like you talked about, just getting those feelings out. And art therapy is also good too. I'm not really much of an artist, but doodling is actually really meditative, and that can help process some of those emotions. Is there anything on here that you do in your life that you want to recommend?
Yeah, I mean, being a musician, I use music a lot to get out emotions. Playing music, writing music has been really helpful for me in my life to get the emotions out, and I can kind of focus them into music. Doing something that you enjoy that really makes you happy, nature, going on a hike, going on a
Hmm.
walk, listening to the nature sounds. I'm a photographer as well, so like, I think there are ways that you can process your emotion and sort of get it out. But I mean, ultimately, I think it's most important to get it out, to not hold it in, and to where it's not just in your mind. So
Right.
that's the most important thing, is how can you use either your creative outlets or journaling or whatever to get the feelings out of your body. And one thing, I mean, we mentioned at the very beginning, but also therapy. If
Hmm.
you have the means to go to therapy, if it's covered by your insurance or whatever, please go to therapy, talk to a professional, use that as a resource, as an asset to your grief recovery if you have the means to do that, for sure. But these are other ways that you can do it if maybe you don't have the assets to do that, or if you just want some extra things that you can start to incorporate into your daily life. So those are a few things that we have found that are really helpful with dealing with grief. But just remember that it's not a quick process. and it will resurface over time. And just to give yourself grace and to feel the emotions you're having. It's totally valid. It's okay to do that.
Yeah, and I think I just wanna point out, with therapy, you know, some people don't have access to therapy or they don't have the money for therapy, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this as, education. It's not necessarily gonna do the same thing as therapy will, but there are also individuals out there that may be like life coaches or grief coaches or something like that. I have worked with people in the past, and find someone that, is educated in grief, that you resonate with, that you feel is going to help you. That can be a more affordable option for some people. It just really depends on their means and their budget and things like that. But I did want to just point that out there.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode about navigating grief. We'll talk to you next time.